He thought she was the new maid, caught red-handed touching things that weren't hers, until a single line in his grandfather's will prove he was the one who didn't understand what was happening in his own house. Hey everyone, welcome back to Wintervale. If stories about second chances and quiet justice warm your heart the way they warm mine, hit that subscribe button and stay until the very end, because this one earns its ending. I have always thought snow has a strange kindness to it, the way it covers everything without judgment and gives the world a chance to start clean again. That feeling shaped this story for me, and I hope by the last scene it settles into your chest the same way it settled into mine. Henry Sutton pulled his car through the iron gates of Hollow Pine Manor just as the first heavy snow of December began to fall over the Vermont hills. He had not planned to stay long. Sign whatever needed signing, meet with the lawyer, and get the old estate ready to sell before his business partner started asking questions about the loan payments again. The manor rose out of the white fields like something from another century, its slate roof already dusted, its windows dark except for one lit room near the back of the house. Henry sat behind the wheel a moment longer than he meant to, staring at a home he hadn't visited since he was 14 years old. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and old paper. Mr. Abernathy, the household's longtime caretaker, met him in the entryway with the same steady calm he'd had for as long as Henry could remember. "Welcome home, Mr. Sutton," he said, taking Henry's coat. "The new specialist has already begun in the East Wing, if you'd like to meet her." Henry barely registered the word specialist. He walked through the grand hallway toward a soft clinking sound and found a young woman kneeling beside an old grandfather clock, carefully cleaning dust from its brass pendulum with a cloth no wider than her palm. She wore a flannel shirt rolled to the elbow and had a pencil tucked behind one ear, her light brown hair falling loose from its braid. "Excuse me," Henry said, sharper than he intended. The woman turned, revealing hazel eyes and a faint scatter of freckles across her nose. "I'm sorry," she said simply, not looking embarrassed at all. "I didn't think anyone was coming until Monday." Henry crossed his arms. "We don't pay the staff to disassemble family heirlooms." She blinked at him, clearly amused rather than offended. "I'm not being paid to leave dust in the gears, either," she said, setting the pendulum gently back into place. Henry studied her for a moment, unsure whether to be annoyed or impressed. "So you're the new maid," he said finally. "I'm really not," she answered, and went back to work as though the conversation were already finished. Before Henry could press further, the front door opened, and a gust of cold air rushed in behind a man in a heavy wool coat carrying a leather folder. Wallace Kimber, the family's attorney, shook the snow from his shoulders and smiled the moment he saw them together. "Good," he said. "You've already met Miss Wells." Henry frowned. "Met who?" "This is Autumn Wells," Wallace said, gesturing toward the young woman still kneeling by the clock. "Your grandfather's personal choice to oversee the full restoration of Hollow Pine Manor." Henry felt something tighten behind his ribs. "I'm sorry, the restoration specialist." Wallace nodded. "One of the most sought-after conservators in New England. And yes, she is 26 years old, before you ask." Henry laughed once, short and disbelieving. She was polishing a clock like she was getting paid by the hour. Wallace opened his folder without answering directly. "Your grandfather's will contains a specific clause." He handed Henry a page with Edmund Sutton's unmistakable signature at the bottom. "The property may not be listed, marketed, or sold until the full restoration is certified complete under the supervision of Miss Autumn Wells." Henry read the line twice, then a third time, as if repetition might change the words. "You're telling me I own this house and I can't sell it?" "That's correct," Wallace said calmly. "Not until the restoration is finished, and only Miss Wells can certify that." Henry looked over at Autumn, who offered him a small, unbothered shrug. "I did try to tell you I wasn't the maid." For the rest of that first afternoon, Henry searched for a way around the clause, flipping through the will himself, while Wallace patiently explained that his grandfather had updated the document only 8 months earlier, with 2 independent witnesses and a notarized addendum specifically protecting it from challenge. "There isn't a loophole," Wallace said finally, closing his own folder. "Believe me, I looked before I brought this to you." That evening, snow kept falling steadily outside the tall windows of the library, gathering along the sills in soft white ridges. Henry stood with a glass of untouched whiskey, watching Autumn move quietly between the shelves with a small notebook, cataloging cracked spines and warped wood as though each one deserved to be remembered individually. "You know most people just see old furniture," he said. "I know," she answered without looking up. "I see who made it and why they cared." Their first real argument happened before he'd even finished his drink. Henry pointed toward a heavy oak sideboard along the far wall. "That goes. We'll replace it with something that actually fits this century." Autumn didn't look up from her notes. "That sideboard has survived 4 generations of Suttons. It can survive one more." He crossed his arms. "I'm not sentimental about furniture." She finally looked at him. "That's not sentiment. That's craftsmanship. Some things deserve to last." Over the following days, the argument repeated itself in different shapes. Over the chandelier, over the cracked stair rail, over a set of dining chairs Henry insisted belonged in a dumpster. Every time, Autumn met his impatience with the same unhurried calm, correcting him gently and refusing to be rushed. Mr. Abernathy, passing through with a tea tray one afternoon, murmured without looking up, "For what it's worth, sir, Miss Wells is winning." Despite the friction, Henry found himself lingering nearby whenever Autumn worked, watching her tighten a hinge or steady a wobbling table leg with the same careful patience she gave to everything else. He couldn't understand why anyone would spend 3 hours mending one drawer when a hardware store sold replacements for $20. Because someone spent 3 weeks building it the first time, she told him, without breaking her focus, and that answer stayed with him longer than he expected it to. One gray afternoon, as fresh snow piled against the greenhouse windows, Autumn carefully lifted an old wooden music box from a dust cloth in the sitting room. Mr. Abernathy paused beside her. "That hasn't played in nearly 10 years, he said quietly. Mr. Sutton stopped winding it after his wife passed. Autumn ran her thumb gently along its edge. "May I try?" The old caretaker's eyes softened. "I think he would like that very much." She worked for almost an hour, replacing a bent spring with a small brass piece from her toolkit, cleaning each tiny gear by hand, while Henry pretended to read by the fire and watched her instead over the top of his book. When she finally turned the key, nothing happened at first, and disappointment flickered across her face before she adjusted one gear and tried again. A soft, wandering melody drifted through the room like something waking up after a long sleep. Miles away, in a quiet room at Birchwood Senior Residence, Edmund Sutton sat by a frosted window that overlooked a snow-covered courtyard. He had not spoken clearly in 3 days, and most mornings the nurses had to remind him gently who he was speaking to. A young nurse named Raina had just adjusted his blanket when he suddenly lifted his head, his cloudy eyes catching a focus they hadn't held in weeks. "Snowdrop," he whispered. The nurse called the front desk, and the front desk called Henry. By the time he and Autumn arrived at Birchwood together, brushing snow from their coats in the entryway, Edmund was sitting upright in bed, his gaze fixed on the door as though he had been waiting his whole life for it to open. The moment Autumn stepped inside, his face broke into an expression Henry hadn't seen from him in years. "There you are," Edmund said, his voice trembling. "You finally came back." Autumn froze in the doorway. "I'm sorry," she said carefully. "I don't think we've met, at least not that I remember." But Edmund only reached out a shaking hand toward her, entirely unbothered by her confusion. "Come here, my little snowdrop," he said, and something in the certainty of his voice made her cross the room without another word of protest. The moment she took his hand, his breathing slowed, and a strange, settled peace filled the small room. Henry stood near the doorway, watching his grandfather, a man who sometimes forgot which decade it was, hold a stranger's hand like it was the most familiar thing in the world. "Who is Snowdrop?" he asked quietly, more to himself than anyone. Nobody answered, because nobody in the room seemed to know, least of all Autumn, whose eyes had gone glassy with a confusion that looked almost like memory trying to surface. Over the following week, Edmund began asking for her by name, or by nickname, every single morning. "Has my Snowdrop come by yet?" He'd ask the nurses, sometimes twice before breakfast. Autumn visited nearly every afternoon after finishing her work at the manor, and slowly Henry noticed his grandfather growing steadier around her, sharper, as though her presence untangled something the illness kept trying to knot shut. One afternoon, while Autumn helped Edmund water the small potted herbs on his windowsill, Henry finally asked the question that had been sitting uneasily in his chest. "Are you sure you didn't plan any of this?" Autumn set down the watering can slowly. You think I planned an 83-year-old man loving me like family? Henry opened his mouth, found nothing worth saying, and closed it again. She smiled. I'll take that as an apology. It wasn't, but it sounded close enough. Edmund, it turned out, had also developed a sudden and suspicious interest in matchmaking. Every visit brought a new excuse. Henry, we're low on blue paint, he announced one Tuesday. Henry frowned. We're not painting anything, Grandpa. For the birdhouse, Edmund said simply, the one Autumn mentioned liking. From across the room, Autumn whispered, I never said that. Edmund only smiled wider. You were thinking it. By the following week, Edmund insisted the two of them drive out together for pie, at a diner conveniently located 40 minutes away in weather that had no business being called good. When the waitress arrived with 2 menus, Edmund answered before either of them could speak. They're together, he said, entirely serious. Henry nearly knocked over his water glass. We are absolutely not. Edmund shrugged. He forgets birthdays, but his heart is decent. Give him time. Henry buried his face in his hands while Autumn laughed so hard she had to set down her fork. I think this might be my favorite version of you, she told him. You think this is funny, he said. I think you're losing an argument to an octogenarian in a hospital robe, she said. I'm losing several, Henry admitted, and for the first time since arriving at Hollow Pine, he laughed too, easily, without meaning to. A few days later, while organizing a shelf of Edmund's old books, Autumn noticed handwritten notes tucked inside the covers of several children's classics. Edmund smiled the moment he saw her holding them. You used to sit right by that window and read those, he said. I did. He nodded slowly. Your father worked our gardens every Saturday. You followed him everywhere, smaller than the watering cans, and you always believed the flowers grew faster if you sang to them. Something in Autumn's expression shifted, softened into a kind of stillness Henry hadn't seen from her before. My father, she said quietly. Edmund's eyes grew distant with memory. Peter Wells, he said. Best man I ever employed, and stubborn as a mule about it too. He'd never let me pay him for half the things he did around this place. He always said kindness shouldn't come with an invoice attached. That evening, driving back to the manor through softly falling snow, Henry and Autumn barely spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. My grandfather never once mentioned your family to me. Autumn watched the white fields blur past the window. My father died when I was 16, she said. He never told me he worked here either. Henry glanced at her. Why do you think that was? She shrugged lightly. Some men believe kindness stops being kindness the moment you talk about it. 2 days later, Edmund seemed unusually alert, his eyes sharp and focused in a way that made Henry uneasy rather than relieved. I fell once, on your staircase, years ago, Edmund said suddenly, staring at the ceiling. I missed the second landing. He turned toward Autumn. Your father caught me before I hit the ground. He wouldn't take $1 for it. Said friends don't send each other invoices. Henry felt something crack quietly open in his chest. You never told me any of this, he said. Edmund looked genuinely surprised. I thought I had, he murmured. For years, Henry had believed his family built everything on their own, brick by brick, debt by debt. Now he was learning that a quiet man named Peter Wells had helped hold it all together once, without asking for anything, and nobody had ever spoken his name at the dinner table. That evening, Attorney Wallace Kimber arrived at the manor carrying a sealed cream envelope. I've been asked to hold this until the right moment, he told Henry, handing it over. Across the front, in Edmund's unsteady handwriting, were 5 words. Only after Autumn returns home. Henry turned the envelope over twice, searching for an explanation that wasn't there. Returns from where, he asked. Wallace only offered a small, knowing smile. I imagine you'll find out. Something shifted quietly in the weeks that followed, not all at once, but steadily, the way frost slowly claims a window pane. Henry still argued with Autumn nearly every day, about furniture, about deadlines, about whether the old chandelier was worth saving, but the arguments no longer felt like battles. They felt more like conversations neither of them wanted to end. One morning, Henry appeared in the workshop holding a thick restoration manual, brow furrowed in concentration. Are you actually studying? Autumn asked, raising an eyebrow. I'm gathering evidence, he said. For what? To prove you're making this sound harder than it actually is, he said, closing the book with unearned confidence. How difficult can repairing one chair possibly be? Autumn gestured toward a battered walnut dining chair. Would you like to find out? 40 minutes later, the chair had one missing leg, two loose joints, and an armrest reattached completely backward. Henry stared at the wreckage with wounded pride. It looked easier in the book, he muttered. Autumn laughed so hard she had to sit down on the workbench. I have officially witnessed history, she said. What history? The first man to make a broken chair somehow more broken, she said, and even Henry couldn't hold back his laughter. From that day forward, Henry stopped trying to replace everything and started asking why instead. Why hide glue instead of modern adhesive? Because someday, someone else will need to repair it too, Autumn told him. Why leave the scratches? Because not every mark needs to be erased. Every answer seemed to reach past the furniture and land somewhere deeper, and Henry found himself listening more carefully than he ever expected to. The manor slowly began to change, and so did the people inside it. Fresh flowers appeared in the dining room again. The old piano was tuned for the first time in a decade. Curtains were cleaned and rehung rather than thrown away. Even Mr. Abernathy admitted, quietly refilling a teapot one evening, that the house finally sounded alive again, and Henry, for once, didn't argue with him. Edmund's health, meanwhile, continued its slow decline. Some mornings he remembered everything with startling clarity. Other mornings he forgot Henry's name entirely, or believed it was still 1990, or asked whether his late wife would be home in time for dinner. Those mornings quietly broke something in Henry's chest. But every single time Autumn walked into the room, without fail, Edmund's eyes lit with recognition. "My little snowdrop," he'd whisper, and the illness never once managed to take that from him. 3 days later, Wallace returned to the manor carrying the sealed envelope, his expression unusually solemn. "The doctors believe today is a good day," he said quietly. "I think it's time." Edmund was resting upstairs, propped against a mountain of pillows, snow drifting steadily past the window behind him. Wallace broke the seal carefully and began to read aloud in Edmund's own carefully chosen words. "Dear Henry, if you're reading this, then autumn has come back to the house, and the first part of my plan has already worked." Henry frowned. "Plan?" Wallace only motioned for him to keep listening. The letter continued. "The day you told me you wanted to sell this house, I understood that something far more valuable had already been sold long before that conversation. Not the property, your way of seeing people." The room fell completely silent except for the soft crackle of the fireplace. "You stopped asking who someone truly was," the letter continued, "and started asking only what they were worth to you." Henry lowered his eyes, every sentence landing with uncomfortable accuracy. He remembered mistaking Autumn for the maid, judging her before learning her name, looking at antique furniture and calculating only its resale value. Wallace kept reading. "So I needed someone to teach you how to look again, not because she was extraordinary in some impossible way, but because she notices things everyone else has learned to ignore. Old wood, old music, old people, old promises. Nothing disappears quietly around her." Tears gathered in Henry's eyes before he even realized it, and he finally understood why his grandfather had insisted on hiring a 26-year-old conservator instead of a famous one. Wallace unfolded the final page. "This is the last part," he said gently. "Autumn Wells was never applying for a position here," the letter read. "She was helping me interview my grandson." The words settled over the room like snow settling on still water, silent and complete. Everything suddenly made sense at once. The restoration clause, the music box, the manufactured errands, the pie, the paint that was never needed. Henry lowered his head, a single tear landing softly on his grandfather's handwriting. "I failed him," he whispered. Wallace shook his head gently. If Edmund believed that, he wouldn't have written the very next line. Henry looked up, and there, smaller than the rest, almost added as an afterthought, were the final words. "If you're reading this with tears in your eyes, then the interview isn't over. It's only just beginning." 2 weeks after Edmund passed quietly in his sleep, with Henry holding one hand and Autumn holding the other, the manor felt impossibly still, the kind of silence that follows every ending before something new learns how to begin. The funeral had been small, exactly as Edmund requested, filled mostly with people whose names Henry had never known, but whose gratitude toward his grandfather ran unmistakably deep. Henry sat alone in the library one evening, the restored music box resting on the desk in front of him, snow falling steadily outside for what felt like the 100th time that winter. He wound the key slowly, and while the familiar melody filled the quiet room, his fingers brushed something uneven along the base of the box, a seam that shouldn't have been there. Mr. Abernathy leaned over his shoulder as Henry carefully pried open a hidden compartment beneath the velvet lining. Inside lay a folded letter and a single pressed snowdrop flower, its petals flattened and pale, but still recognizable after what must have been years. Henry unfolded the letter with careful hands, and Edmund's familiar script covered the page in smaller, more private handwriting than before. "You already knew her once," the letter read, "though you were far too young to remember why." Henry frowned, and then, slowly, a memory surfaced that he hadn't touched in nearly 2 decades. A summer afternoon in the garden, a little girl who had scraped her knee on the gravel path and cried because she'd torn the hem of her favorite dress. He remembered handing her his handkerchief without thinking twice about it, remembered her tear-streaked smile as she thanked him, remembered someone calling her away before he ever learned her name. When Autumn walked into the library moments later carrying restoration notes, she stopped cold at the sight of the pressed flower resting in Henry's palm. "That was you," she said softly, recognition dawning slowly across her face. "You remember?" he asked. "Not your face," she admitted, "but I remember the boy who gave a crying stranger his handkerchief instead of laughing at her." For the first time since Edmund's passing, they both laughed quietly together, not because the grief had disappeared, but because somehow, even from beyond it, Edmund had left them one final gentle memory to discover on their own, together, exactly the way he must have hoped they would. But not everyone in Henry's life had spent that winter growing warmer. His cousin Preston Hale, who had co-signed on Henry's failing real estate ventures years earlier and lost considerably more than he ever admitted out loud, had been quietly negotiating behind the scenes with a resort developer called Ridgeline Group, promising them first access to Hollow Pines acreage the moment the estate went up for sale. Preston had grown up in Edmund's shadow, always compared, always slightly overlooked, and years of watching Henry inherit everything he himself had wanted had curdled into something colder than jealousy. When the restoration clause blocked the sale entirely, Preston's debts to Ridgeline came due faster than he could manage, and desperation began pushing him toward decisions he wouldn't have considered a year earlier. Late one night, during the worst blizzard Vermont had seen in a decade, Preston drove out to the manor under the excuse of checking on Henry, wind howling so hard the old windows rattled in their frames. While Henry and Mr. Abernathy were occupied boarding up a loose shutter on the east side of the house, Preston slipped down into the basement and quietly loosened a corroded pipe joint feeding the workshop, where Autumn stored the estate's most fragile, half-restored pieces. By the time anyone noticed the sound of rushing water, it was already too late to stop it easily. Autumn had gone back out to the workshop alone to retrieve a ledger of restoration records she'd forgotten, and within minutes the flooding water had risen past her ankles, soaking the base of an antique writing desk that had survived 4 generations of Suttons and nearly a century of careful keeping. She grabbed what she could, fighting to keep her footing on the slick concrete floor while trying to drag the heaviest crate of documents toward higher ground, the icy water climbing steadily past her knees. A support shelf gave way above her without warning, and a heavy wooden beam crashed down, striking her shoulder hard enough to knock her sideways into the rising water, pain flashing bright and sudden through her arm. Henry heard her cry out over the howling wind and reached the workshop within seconds, wading through freezing water that soaked him instantly to the thigh. He found Autumn half submerged, cradling her injured arm against her chest, still trying uselessly to reach the crate of documents even as the cold visibly stole the strength from her limbs. "Leave it," he shouted over the storm, pulling her upright. "Leave all of it. I don't care about any of it if it costs me you." He half carried, half dragged her through the flooded basement and up the stairs, Mr. Abernathy already calling for an ambulance from the hallway above. Outside, the blizzard had grown thick enough to swallow the driveway whole, and for a long, terrifying stretch of minutes, Henry sat wrapped around Autumn on the cold stone steps, pressing his coat against her shivering shoulders and refusing to let go until the ambulance lights finally cut through the white. At the hospital, the doctor confirmed a dislocated shoulder and mild hypothermia, painful, but nowhere near as catastrophic as it might have been. While Autumn rested, sheriff's deputies arrived at Henry's request to examine the corroded pipe joint that had somehow failed on the one night a storm provided perfect cover, and it didn't take long for a maintenance log and a set of tire tracks frozen into the snow near the service entrance to point directly toward Preston. Confronted the next morning in the manor's front hall, Preston didn't even try very hard to deny it, his composure crumbling almost the moment Henry mentioned the tire tracks. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt," he said, his voice cracking. "I just needed the sale to go through before Ridgeline called in what I owed them." Henry stared at his cousin, feeling anger and something closer to grief tangled together in his chest. "You could have just asked me for help." "You never once asked," Preston admitted quietly. "You just assumed I'd figure it out on my own, the way I always have." It wasn't a full excuse, and Henry didn't offer him one. But standing there in the entryway his grandfather had walked through for 60 years, he found himself choosing consequences over cruelty. He didn't press criminal charges. Instead, with Wallace's help, he restructured Preston's debt against future estate income, on the strict condition that Preston never contact Ridgeline again. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was closer to the kind of quiet mercy his grandfather had spent a lifetime practicing, and something about extending it steadied Henry more than he expected it to. Autumn, her arm still in a sling 2 days later, watched him from the library doorway as he hung up the phone with Wallace. "You didn't have to be that generous with him," she said. Henry shrugged, a little tired. "I think I finally understand why my grandfather always was." Winter deepened around Hollow Pine Manor, and with it came an offer neither of them had expected. Autumn's phone rang one gray morning while she and Henry sat finishing coffee in the kitchen, and when she stepped back inside from the porch, her expression had shifted into something unreadable. "The Denver Heritage Museum," she said quietly. "They want me full-time, starting in 3 weeks." Henry felt something drop quietly in his chest, though he kept his voice level. "That's an incredible opportunity," he said, and meant it, even as it cost him something to say. Autumn nodded slowly, staring down at her coffee. "It is," she agreed. 3 weeks. That's all the time there was left, hanging unspoken and heavy between them for the rest of that afternoon. Upstairs in the quiet of the empty house, in the room Edmund used to occupy whenever he visited, sunlight caught the frost patterns on the window in a way that made Henry pause. He thought of his grandfather's final line in that letter, of an interview that was never truly finished, and understood, with sudden clarity, that his grandfather hadn't been asking whether Autumn would stay. He'd been asking who Henry would choose to become once she was gone. The final days passed too quickly, the way important days always seem to. On the morning of Autumn's flight, her suitcase waited by the front door while she said her goodbyes to Mr. Abernathy, who hugged her longer than either of them expected, and walked slowly through every restored room of the manor one final time. The piano, the music box, the grandfather clock ticking steady and true again after 10 silent years. Henry carried her bags to the car without a word, and neither of them mentioned Denver or staying or anything at all beyond the weather. When the trunk finally closed, Autumn offered him a small, genuine smile. "Thank you for everything," she said. "Safe travels," he answered, and watched her drive away down the long snow-lined driveway until the taillights disappeared completely into the white. Mr. Abernathy found him still standing there minutes later. "Aren't you going after her, sir?" Henry shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "Then what will you do?" the old caretaker asked, clearly baffled. Henry turned back toward the manor, toward the music box resting quiet in the library, toward the life his grandfather had spent his final months quietly preparing him for. "I'm going to answer his question," he said, and walked back inside, not toward his car, but toward the future waiting for him. Autumn's train pulled out of the station the following morning without Henry anywhere in sight. She checked her phone twice at the platform, then a third time once the train was already moving, hoping without quite admitting it for some message that never came. When the manor disappeared behind the tree line for good, she leaned her head against the cold window glass and told herself, quietly, that this was probably how the story was always meant to end. For hours later, during a scheduled transfer stop, her phone buzzed with a call from Mr. Abernathy. "Miss Wells, I know you're most of the way to Denver by now," he said carefully, "but if you haven't gone too far, there's something I believe you ought to see." Her heart caught in her throat. "Is everything all right?" The old caretaker chuckled softly. Oh, better than all right. I believe Mr. Sutton would be very pleased. Instead of continuing west, Autumn found herself turning back through the familiar snow-covered roads toward Hollow Pine that same evening, laughing quietly at herself the entire drive. I really am terrible at goodbyes, she muttered to the empty car. As she turned up the long driveway, she slowed the car to a stop, stunned by what stretched out in front of her. The manor was glowing, every window filled with warm golden light against the deep blue evening snow. Cars lined both sides of the driveway. Laughter and music drifted out across the frozen garden, where a dozen local teenagers were carrying tools and lumber in and out of the old workshop, their breath fogging in the cold air. A freshly carved wooden sign stood near the front gate, simple and bright beneath a fresh dusting of snow. The Snowdrop House, it read, and beneath it in smaller letters, free restoration workshops, community trade classes for local youth. Autumn stepped out of the car slowly, hardly trusting what she was seeing. Mr. Abernathy appeared on the porch, grinning ear to ear. I was wondering how long it would take you, he said warmly. All this, she asked, looking around in disbelief. You should ask him yourself, the caretaker said, nodding toward the garden. Henry knelt beside a group of teenagers near the old greenhouse, sleeves rolled up, sawdust dusting his sweater, patiently showing one of them how to sand down a warped shutter without splitting the grain. One of the kids spotted Autumn first. Mr. Sutton, the lady from the pictures is here, she called out, and Henry turned, his face breaking into a slow, unguarded smile the moment their eyes met across the snow. I wasn't sure you'd actually come back, he admitted, walking toward her. Autumn glanced around at the glowing windows, the busy garden, the sign near the gate still catching soft flakes of falling snow. You didn't sell it, she said. He shook his head. No, he answered quietly. I finally understood what he was trying to leave me. It was never really about the house. It was about what the house could still become if somebody kept the door open. Henry reached into his coat and drew out the restored music box, carrying it carefully across the snow toward her. This belongs with you, he said. Autumn shook her head gently. It belongs here, with everyone, she said. He smiled. Both then. But he wanted you to open it. For the first time, Henry didn't wind the key himself. He placed the box gently into her hands and waited. Autumn turned the small brass key slowly, and the familiar melody drifted out across the snow-covered garden, soft and warm and impossibly steady. Conversation gradually quieted around them. A few of the teenagers paused their work, listening. Even the falling snow seemed to slow for a moment, catching the porch lights like scattered stars settling gently onto the world below. She looked up at Henry, eyes bright with something between joy and disbelief. I think I finally passed, he said, his voice a little rough. Autumn studied him for a long moment before shaking her head slowly. No, she said softly. You finally stopped trying to pass. Henry laughed under his breath, because she was right, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he wasn't performing for anyone, not his grandfather, not Preston, not even himself. The music slowly faded into silence. Autumn closed the lid gently, then stepped closer and took his hand without a word, lacing her fingers through his the way the last piece of a puzzle finally settles into place. He looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her. So Denver loses a conservator, he asked quietly. Denver will find another one, she said, smiling. And Vermont? She glanced around at the glowing house, the laughing teenagers, the old rocking chair sitting empty by the library window where Edmund used to watch the snow fall. I think this place still needs one, she said. Henry didn't answer with words. He simply pulled her closer, snow settling softly around them both as the manor glowed warm and steady behind them. An old house finally full of the people it had always been waiting for. Some people inherit money. Some inherit land. But the luckiest ones inherit a reason to leave the front door open, and someone willing to walk back through it, even after the train has already pulled away. That first winter at the Snowdrop House became a tradition nobody had planned, but everybody kept returning for. By 9 each Sunday morning, the old manor filled slowly with laughter, coffee, and the steady tap of tools against old wood. Teenagers came to learn carpentry. Neighbors came to repair grandmother's furniture. Some came simply for the coffee and the company, exactly the way Edmund always would have wanted it. Autumn stood in the workshop one such morning in a denim apron dusted with wood shavings, gently correcting a nervous student's grip on an old chisel. Slow down, she told him. Oldwood remembers every rushed mistake. What if I ruin it? The boy asked anxiously. She smiled. You won't. And even if you do, we'll learn to fix it together, the same way somebody once taught me. In the kitchen, Henry poured coffee that still wasn't particularly good, according to most of the volunteers who tried it. Mr. Abernathy wandered through with a tray of cookies and offered his usual verdict without being asked. Miss Wells still makes the better coffee, sir. Henry sighed dramatically. I own this house. You do, sir. I pay for everything in it. You do, sir. Then why does hers taste better? Because she lets it finish brewing, the old caretaker said, and Autumn's laughter carried in from the hallway before Henry could even manage a comeback. Edmund was gone, but Hollow Pine never quite felt like he had truly left it. His rocking chair still sat by the library window, and every Sunday, without fail, someone left a small fresh flower on the sill beside it. Nobody ever admitted who. It simply kept appearing, the way quiet kindness so often does, without needing credit or an audience to matter. That evening, as the last golden light faded behind the snow-covered hills, Autumn walked to the music box resting on the library table and wound the key one final time. The familiar melody drifted softly through every corner of the old manor, and conversations gently quieted around it, the way they always did now, out of habit and out of love. It no longer belonged only to Edmund's memory. It belonged to everyone who had found something worth staying for inside those walls. Henry slipped his hand into Autumn's without either of them saying a word. Outside, the season's first fresh snow was beginning to fall again over the Vermont hills, settling gently across a house that had learned, slowly and imperfectly, exactly how to stay warm. If this story warmed something in you tonight, I would love to know down in the comments. Do you believe home is simply the place you live, or is it truly the people who make you want to come back to it? Thank you so much for spending this time with me, and I'll see you in the next story here on Wintervale.